Hey, welcome back. Pull up a chair, because today we're doing something a little different. Instead of talking about Valley Forge, I want to take you there. We're going to walk through that winter, December 1777 to June 1778, through the eyes of the men who actually lived it. Common soldiers, officers, a blacksmith's apprentice from Pennsylvania, a farmer's son from Massachusetts. Men who had no idea whether they'd survive, whether their cause would survive, or whether the whole thing was a catastrophic mistake. This is the story of Valley Forge. And I promise you, it is not what most people think it is. Most people picture Valley Forge and they think, snow, freezing men, maybe a painting of Washington on a horse looking heroic. And yes, there was snow. There were absolutely freezing men. But the real story is so much more complicated, so much more human, and honestly, so much more interesting than that. Because Valley Forge wasn't just a place where soldiers suffered. It was a place where an army that was practically falling apart got rebuilt from the inside out. It was where a ragtag collection of exhausted, starving, angry men somehow became something that could actually win a war. So let's go back. Let's walk in. It's December 19th, 1777. The Continental Army has just finished what, by any honest measure, has been a rough year. A really rough year. They lost Philadelphia, the capital of the new nation, to the British in September. They fought at Brandywine, they fought at Germantown, they fought hard, and they lost both times. Now the British are sitting comfortably in Philadelphia, in nice warm houses, hosting dinner parties, and waiting out the winter. British generals don't campaign in winter. It's just not done. Washington's army, meanwhile, is marching toward a place called Valley Forge, about 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia, in southeastern Pennsylvania. And the men who are making that march are in rough shape. When I say rough shape, I want you to understand what that actually looked like. Some men have no shoes, not worn-out shoes or thin shoes. No shoes. They are walking through frozen mud and snow in bare feet or with rags tied around their feet. The trail they march on is literally marked by blood stains in the snow. That's not a dramatic embellishment. That is what officers and soldiers wrote about in their letters and journals. Blood-stained snow from men with no shoes. Their clothes are in tatters. The Continental Army never really solved its supply problem, and by December 1777, a lot of these men are wearing coats that are more whole than coat. Some have blankets wrapped around them like cloaks. Some are just cold, deeply, dangerously cold. And they're hungry. Most of them have been surviving on whatever they could forage or whatever trickled through the army's badly broken supply chain. Flour. Sometimes meat, but not reliably. Hunger was a constant companion, not the I skipped lunch kind of hunger, but the grinding, exhausting, thought-consuming kind. These men are tired in a way that goes beyond sleep deprivation. It's a tiredness that gets into your bones. They've been fighting and marching for months. A lot of them want to go home. Some of them are going home. Desertions are a real problem, and Washington knows it. So this is the army arriving at Valley Forge. Not a glorious fighting force. A cold, hungry, exhausted, demoralized group of men. Somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 of them, trudging through December in Pennsylvania, about to spend the winter in a place with basically no infrastructure. Why Valley Forge? Why there? Washington chose it deliberately, and the choice made strategic sense. Valley Forge sits on a plateau above the Schuylkill River. It's defensible. If the British came out of Philadelphia to attack, the terrain gave the Americans some natural advantages. It was close enough to Philadelphia to keep an eye on the enemy, but far enough to be relatively safe. And it was close enough to the surrounding countryside that foraging parties could theoretically gather supplies. Theoretically. The other reason Valley Forge made sense: politics. There was enormous pressure on Washington. From Congress, from civilians, from everyone, to keep the army somewhere it could protect Pennsylvania and not just disappear into the wilderness for the winter. People wanted the army present. Washington was trying to balance military sense with political reality, and Valley Forge was the compromise. But when the men arrived and looked around, what they saw was a plateau, some trees, a creek. That's about it. There were no barracks, no buildings, no shelters. Whatever they were going to live in, they were going to have to build themselves. Welcome to Valley Forge. The first order of business. Shelter. Washington issued a design, a standard hut design that all units would follow, which was smart, because it meant they could build efficiently and know what supplies they needed. Each hut was supposed to be 14 feet by 16 feet, with walls about 6.5 feet high. Log construction, with clay chinking to fill the gaps. Room for 12 soldiers. Washington even offered a cash prize, $100, to whichever group of soldiers built the best hut in the shortest time. This was clever. He was turning a grim necessity into a competition, giving men something to focus on, something to work toward, and a reason to take pride in what they were building. The men started chopping trees, hundreds of trees, then thousands. The sound of axes rang out across the plateau constantly in those early weeks, and slowly, painfully slowly, the huts went up. Now, I want you to think about what this actually involved. These men are cold, hungry, and exhausted. They don't have proper tools. Not enough of them, anyway. They're cutting down full-grown trees, hauling the logs, notching and fitting them together, collecting clay for chinking. This is back-breaking physical labor performed by people who are already at the edge of their physical limits. And while they're doing it, they're living in tents, or just outside, in December, in Pennsylvania. Some regiments got their huts up relatively quickly. Others struggled. The pace of construction varied enormously depending on how many tools were available, how many men were actually physically capable of working, and just the luck of what kind of trees were nearby. For several weeks, the camp was a chaotic mix of half-built huts, mud, felled trees, stumps, and thousands of miserable men trying to survive each night until they could get their shelters finished. The mud deserves its own paragraph. Valley Forge mud is something the soldiers wrote about with a kind of horrified awe. This wasn't ordinary mud. It was deep, persistent, boot-sucking, everywhere mud. The constant traffic of thousands of men and horses churned the ground into something approaching a swamp. Men fell into it. Wagons got stuck in it. Supplies sat in it. The mud was, in some ways, as much of an enemy as the cold. But here's the thing. The huts did get built. Regiment by regiment, unit by unit, a city of log huts rose on that plateau. By January, most of the men had some kind of solid shelter. It wasn't warm exactly. The fireplaces smoked terribly, and the clay chinking left gaps. But it was better than a tent. It was enormously better than sleeping outside. Washington himself didn't move into a proper headquarters until he was confident his men were sheltered. He stayed in his tent for weeks, which was noted and appreciated by the soldiers. It was a small thing, maybe, but those small things matter when you're trying to hold an army together on morale alone. His eventual headquarters was a stone house belonging to a man named Isaac Potts, a 2-story structure that still stands today, if you ever want to visit. Washington worked out of that house for the entire encampment. It became the nerve center of everything, the military planning, the political correspondence, the endless logistical battles to keep the army supplied and functional. Because even as the physical city of Valley Forge was going up, Washington was fighting another war, the war against his own supply system. Here's something that surprises a lot of people. The land around Valley Forge in 1777 was not barren wasteland. It was actually fairly productive farmland. There was food in the region, there was livestock, there were supplies. So why were Washington's men starving? The answer is complicated, and honestly, it's one of the more frustrating parts of this whole story. First, the supply chain for the Continental Army was a mess. The Quartermaster General's department, the people responsible for getting supplies to the army, was understaffed, underfunded, and badly organized. Wagons broke down, drivers deserted. Roads were impassable in winter. Food that was purchased and theoretically on its way to the army often just didn't arrive, or arrived spoiled, or arrived in quantities that were nowhere near enough. Second, money. The Continental Congress was trying to fund a war without the power to tax, relying on paper money, Continentals, that was rapidly losing value because they just kept printing more of it. Farmers and merchants were increasingly reluctant to accept Continental currency in exchange for their goods. Why sell your cattle for paper that might be worthless next year? This made purchasing supplies genuinely difficult. Third, and this is the part that really stings, some of the surrounding population was actively selling to the British instead of the Americans. The British in Philadelphia were paying in hard currency, real silver and gold. A lot of farmers chose the sure thing. You can judge them for that, but you can also understand it. They had families to feed too. Fourth, and Washington was furious about this, Congress had created a system that made the quartermaster and commissary positions unprofitable and unattractive for competent people. The men who should have been running the supply system either couldn't make the job work financially or just weren't skilled enough. It was a structural failure, not just bad luck. The result of all this was what soldiers called the starving time. There were periods, multiple periods over that winter, when the army essentially had no food, when the ration was nothing, when men went days without eating anything substantial. Washington wrote desperate letters to Congress. Some of the most famous documents from this period are Washington's letters begging, pleading, demanding that Congress fix the supply situation. He wrote at one point that unless things changed, the army would starve, dissolve, or disperse. That wasn't rhetoric. That was a genuine assessment of the situation. There's a moment from this period that I find particularly striking. Soldiers would sometimes cry out from their huts, and the phrase that echoed through the camp became a kind of dark rallying cry, "No meat, no meat!" It was partly complaint, partly black humor, partly just men letting out the frustration of genuine suffering. And it was audible enough that officers wrote about hearing it. The food that was available was often not great. Firecake, a mixture of flour and water cooked on a flat stone, became a staple. It's basically a cracker, not particularly nutritious, not particularly filling, but it was something. Men became creative about what counted as food. Soldiers foraged constantly, which sometimes helped and sometimes just stripped the surrounding countryside bare. Horses were dying too. The army's horses were as underfed as the men, and when horses die, you lose mobility, you lose the ability to move artillery, you lose the ability to run your supply wagons, even when you have supplies. Dead horses became another feature of Valley Forge. They were everywhere, and the smell was something multiple soldiers mentioned. Now, sometime in late February, the supply situation began to improve. Not because Congress suddenly got its act together, but because Washington made a move. He appointed Nathaniel Greene as the new quartermaster general. Greene didn't want the job. He was a fighting general, one of Washington's best, and he saw the logistics role as a demotion, almost an insult. But he took it because Washington needed him, and he was a man who did his duty. And once he took it, he attacked the problem with the same energy he brought to combat. Greene reorganized the department. He used his network, his force of personality, and his strategic mind to get the supply lines moving. He was ruthless about requisitioning what the army needed from the surrounding countryside. Not stealing exactly, but making very firm requests backed by the implicit authority of the army. He fixed what he could fix, worked around what he couldn't, and within weeks the food situation at Valley Forge began, slowly, to improve. By March, men were eating more regularly. Not well, exactly. The army's diet remained monotonous and nutritionally insufficient. But the genuine crisis periods became less frequent. The army wasn't going to starve to death. That was not a small thing. Here's a fact that tends to get lost in the Valley Forge story. Most of the men who died there didn't die of cold or starvation. They died of disease. Of the roughly 2,000 soldiers who died at Valley Forge over that winter, the overwhelming majority were killed by illness. Typhus, typhoid fever, dysentery, pneumonia, smallpox. These diseases moved through the camp and killed men who might have survived the cold and the hunger just fine. Why was disease such a problem? Partly it was the conditions. Overcrowded huts, poor sanitation, men who were already physically weakened by hunger and cold and exhaustion. Partly it was the state of 18th century medicine, which was genuinely limited in what it could do for infectious disease. And partly it was something that Washington actually addressed, with real foresight: inoculation. Smallpox was a constant threat to armies in this period. It could move through a camp and wipe out a significant percentage of your fighting force. Washington had seen it happen. He had, in fact, survived smallpox himself as a young man in Barbados, which gave him immunity, and maybe gave him a particular appreciation for how devastating it could be. Early in the encampment, Washington made the decision to inoculate the Continental Army against smallpox. This was genuinely controversial at the time. Inoculation, which in this era meant deliberately infecting someone with a mild form of smallpox, not the later vaccine method developed by Jenner, was not universally trusted. It carried real risk, and doing it to thousands of soldiers at once meant those soldiers would be temporarily incapacitated, which created its own military vulnerability. But Washington did it anyway, because he calculated that the long-term risk of a smallpox epidemic was worse than the short-term vulnerability of mass inoculation. And he was right. The Continental Army largely avoided the kind of catastrophic smallpox outbreaks that had devastated earlier campaigns. Historians have argued that this single public health decision was one of Washington's most important contributions to American victory in the Revolution. The other diseases were harder to manage. Typhus, camp fever as they called it, spread through the overcrowded, poorly ventilated huts. Men who got sick were moved to the hospitals, which were in some of the surrounding farm buildings and facilities. The hospitals at Valley Forge were grim places. The Army's medical corps was as under-resourced as every other part of the Army's support system. Medications were scarce. Trained doctors were scarce. The men who ended up in the hospital were often in real trouble. Dr. Albigence Waldo, a surgeon from Connecticut, kept a diary at Valley Forge that is one of the most vivid primary sources we have from that winter. He writes about men coming to him with conditions that he barely had the supplies to treat. He writes about his own exhaustion, his own illness, his own moments of despair. He writes about the smell. The sick, close, smoky smell of the hospital facilities. In ways that make you grateful you're reading about it from a comfortable distance. The death toll accumulated steadily. Not in dramatic battlefield fashion. Not in one terrible day or one catastrophic engagement. Just steadily, day after day, men who were sick and weak and had no real medical safety net to catch them. 2,000 men over the winter. That's roughly 200 men a month. That's roughly 6 or 7 men every single day. It's worth sitting with that number for a moment. And yet, and this is part of what makes Valley Forge so remarkable, the Army did not collapse. Men died, men deserted, men were sick, men were hungry. But the core of the Army held together. And there were reasons for that, some of which were about Washington himself, and one of which arrived from Europe and changed everything. Let's talk about George Washington for a minute, because he's obviously central to this story, and also because the Valley Forge version of Washington is, I think, more interesting than the marble statue version most of us learned about in school. Washington in the winter of 1777 to 78 was under enormous pressure from multiple directions simultaneously, and he was handling it in ways that reveal a lot about who he actually was. From the army, he was getting constant reports of suffering, disease, desertion, and supply failures. His generals were frustrated, his soldiers were miserable, and he had to somehow hold this together day by day while simultaneously trying to manage the strategic situation. From Congress, he was getting criticism. There were members of Congress who questioned his leadership after the losses at Brandywine and Germantown and the fall of Philadelphia. Some of them were actively talking about whether Washington should be replaced. There was even a loosely organized movement, sometimes called the Conway Cabal, though historians debate how organized it really was. That was promoting General Horatio Gates, who had won the significant victory at Saratoga in October, as an alternative to Washington. Washington was aware of this. He was angry about it, and his private letters from this period show that anger. But he didn't go public with it. He didn't make it a political fight. He focused on the job and trusted that his record would speak for itself. It took real discipline to do that, especially when he felt, probably correctly, that some people were actively working against him. From outside the army, he was dealing with a civilian population that had very complicated feelings about having 12,000 soldiers camped in their neighborhood. Some locals were helpful, providing information, occasionally supplies, assistance. Others were selling to the British, which drove Washington crazy. And there was always the political pressure to do something, to be aggressive, to prove the army's worth by going on the offensive. Washington generally resisted this because he understood that an underfed, undertrained army going up against the British in winter was a recipe for catastrophe. But the restraint cost him politically, and through all of this, Washington kept working. The letters he wrote during Valley Forge are extraordinary in their sheer volume and their range. He's writing to Congress about supplies. He's writing to state governors about recruiting. He's writing to his generals about military planning. He's writing to friends about the political situation. He's managing the endless, unglamorous administrative work of keeping an army alive. He also walked the camp regularly. This was noted by multiple soldiers. That Washington came around, that you might see him riding through, that he was visible and present. This mattered more than it might sound. When you're cold and hungry and wondering whether any of this is worth it, seeing the general, the man at the top, the man who had staked his entire reputation on this cause, seeing that man present, not in a warm house in Philadelphia, but right there in the camp, that meant something. There's a famous story about Washington praying alone in the snow at Valley Forge, which was later turned into a painting and became one of those iconic American images. Whether it happened exactly that way is genuinely uncertain. The story comes from a single account written years later. But the image it captures, Washington in private prayer, uncertain and human and asking for help, has resonated because it feels true to something about the man. He was not without doubt. He was not without fear. He carried an enormous weight that winter. The prayer story, whether literally accurate or not, captures something real. What's genuinely documented, though, is that Washington's confidence in his men never publicly broke. He was honest in private about how dire things were. But in his public statements, in his orders to the army, in his presence in the camp, he maintained the message. We can do this. We're going to get through this. This is not the end. Whether he believed it himself on the darkest nights is a question only Washington could have answered, and he never quite did. If you know one name from Valley Forge besides Washington, it should probably be Friedrich Wilhelm August Heinrich Ferdinand von Steuben, or, as everyone just called him, Baron von Steuben. He arrived at Valley Forge in February 1778, and what happened next is genuinely one of the great stories of the American Revolution. Von Steuben was a Prussian officer, or claimed to be anyway. The full truth of his background is a little complicated. He had served in the Prussian army during the 7 Years' War and gained real experience. But the specific ranks and titles he claimed when presenting himself to American officials were, let's say, somewhat embellished. He called himself a lieutenant general in the Prussian service, which was not exactly accurate. Benjamin Franklin, who was helping him connect with Washington, may have known this and decided not to ask too many questions, because Franklin was a smart man who recognized that what the Continental Army needed was a trained military drillmaster, and von Steuben clearly fit that description. Von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge and immediately saw what the problem was, and the problem was not primarily supplies or disease or even cold. The problem was that the Continental Army did not know how to be an army. This sounds harsh. These men were brave and they had been fighting for 2 years, but there's a difference between brave men who fight and a trained military force that operates with discipline and precision. The Continental soldiers were mostly the first thing, and not yet the second. They didn't march in formation reliably. They didn't know standard drill movements that would allow officers to maneuver them efficiently on a battlefield. Different regiments had been trained by different people using different methods. French methods, British methods, whatever the local militia had used before these men joined the Continental Army. And none of it was consistent. When orders were given in battle, units didn't always respond the way they were supposed to. This had real consequences on the battlefield. And here's another thing. The continental system of having officers delegate all training to non-commissioned officers, sergeants, meant that officers were often standing around watching their men do things incorrectly without intervening. In the Prussian system that von Steuben came from, officers drilled their men personally. They led training, they demonstrated, they got on the field. Von Steuben thought the American system was insane, and he was determined to change it. He couldn't speak English when he arrived. He had to work through interpreters, primarily his aides, including a young French officer and a young American who would translate his instructions on the spot. This led to some genuinely funny moments. Von Steuben, a naturally ebullient and enthusiastic man, was also a profane man. When the drilling wasn't going well, he would apparently exhaust his French and German profanity and then turn to his aide and say, in French, something along the lines of, "Come here and swear for me in English. I don't know enough English to do it myself." The soldiers loved him for this. He was demanding but never cold. He was clearly capable. When he demonstrated a drill movement himself, he did it well, which impressed the men. And he had a quality that great trainers and coaches have across all eras. He could see exactly what was wrong and explain exactly how to fix it. He started with a model company. Rather than trying to drill 12,000 men at once, he picked 100 or so men and worked with them intensively, got them doing the movements correctly. Then those men became instructors themselves and spread the knowledge through the rest of the army. It was an elegant, efficient approach. The drill manual von Steuben developed at Valley Forge, the regulations for the order and discipline of the troops of the United States, became the standard manual for the Continental Army and remained influential in American military doctrine for decades afterward. He wrote it in French. It was translated into English, and it gave the Army the common language it had been missing. Watch what happens on the parade ground over those weeks in February and March. Men who arrived at Valley Forge struggling to march in a straight line are now wheeling and turning and maneuvering with something approaching precision. The movements that had been chaotic are becoming coordinated. Orders are being followed quickly and accurately. There's a confidence developing, the confidence that comes from knowing what you're supposed to do and being able to do it. Washington watched this transformation and understood exactly what it meant. Von Steuben was turning his survival force into a fighting force. He was giving the army something it had never quite had, professional military competence, and the timing was perfect, because spring was coming, and with spring, the war would resume. And Washington now had something he didn't have in December, an army that might actually be ready. Von Steuben gets a lot of the attention and he deserves it. But Valley Forge that winter was full of remarkable people doing remarkable things, and it's worth spending some time with a few of them. Marquis de Lafayette was there. He was 20 years old and had been in America for less than a year, but he had already proven himself brave and able at Brandywine, where he was wounded. Washington had developed a genuine fondness for him, something almost paternal. Lafayette spent the winter at Valley Forge, working, learning, and strengthening his bond with Washington and the American cause. He would go on to play a crucial role in the final years of the war. Nathaniel Greene, as mentioned, took over the quartermaster role and began fixing the supply situation. Greene was one of Washington's most reliable and talented generals, and his willingness to take a job he didn't want because the army needed him says something important about his character. He never got quite as famous as some of the other founders, but serious historians consistently rank him among the most capable military figures America produced in this period. Anthony Wayne was there. Mad Anthony. Wayne, the nickname came from his aggressive, fearless fighting style, spent the winter working his men hard, pushing them to maintain discipline and readiness, even in the worst conditions. He was a man of intense personality and absolute commitment to the cause. Henry Knox, Washington's chief of artillery, was there. Knox was a former bookseller from Boston who had taught himself military science from the books in his shop and turned out to be a genuine artillery genius. He was a large, jovial man with a serious military mind, and his relationship with Washington was one of the more durable partnerships of the war, and there were the foreign volunteers. Europeans who had come to fight for the American cause for various reasons, some idealistic, some practical, some just looking for adventure. Von Steuben was the most important, but there were others, and they brought skills and perspectives that enriched what the army was building. There's also Martha Washington. She came to Valley Forge, as she came to most of Washington's winter encampments. She organized relief efforts, sewing circles to make clothes and shirts for the soldiers, visiting the sick, maintaining a social presence that was genuinely important for morale. The presence of officers' wives at the encampment was a signal of permanence and commitment. It said, "This is real, we're staying, we believe in this." Martha Washington was also, by all accounts, remarkably good at the role. She was warm and practical, not showy. She didn't complain about the conditions, even though they were difficult for her too. She set a tone that others followed. We've talked about Washington and von Steuben and the famous names, but let's spend some time with the people who actually made up this army. Who were these men? They were largely young. Teenagers and men in their 20s make up the bulk of any army, and this one was no different. They came from every state, every class, every background. There were farmers' sons who'd never been far from home before. There were craftsmen and apprentices and laborers. There were men who had volunteered out of genuine ideological conviction. Men who had read common sense and believed in what Paine was saying about liberty and tyranny. There were men who had enlisted because the signing bonus was good and they needed the money. There were men who had been more or less compelled to enlist by community pressure. There were also, notably, black soldiers. African Americans served in the Continental Army at Valley Forge, in numbers that historians have worked to better document in recent decades. Some were free men who had volunteered. Some were enslaved men whose enslavers had sent them as substitutes. Some regiments, particularly from New England, were integrated. Others were not. The story of black service at Valley Forge and in the Revolution more broadly is complicated and sometimes painful, but it is absolutely part of the story. And these men were there, suffering the same cold and hunger as everyone else, fighting for a country that had not yet decided what it believed about their humanity. There were also soldiers from other countries, Irish immigrants, German immigrants, men from across the Atlantic who had made America their home and were willing to fight for it. What kept them there? This is the question I keep coming back to, because there were real options. You could desert. Plenty of men did. The army couldn't stop everyone, and the surrounding countryside offered at least the possibility of hiding out and waiting for the war to end. The conditions at Valley Forge were bad enough that the rational, self-interested choice might have been to leave, but most of the men stayed. Some stayed because of fear of the punishment for desertion, fear of the social shame. Some stayed because they had nowhere to go. Their homes were far away. Some stayed because of loyalty to their regiment and their friends. The men around them had become their people, and you don't abandon your people. And some stayed because they believed. They believed that what they were doing mattered. They believed that the idea of America, this new country, this experiment in self-governance, this notion that free men could determine their own destiny, was worth suffering for. The letters and journals from Valley Forge are full of this. Men who are clearly exhausted and clearly miserable will describe the cause in terms of genuine conviction. They know what they're fighting for, and they think it's important enough to stay. That ideological commitment is one of the things that made the Continental Army different from the professional armies of Europe, and one of the things that ultimately made it effective. The British soldiers at Philadelphia were skilled and disciplined and well supplied, but a lot of them were fighting because it was their job. Many of the men at Valley Forge were fighting because they chose to. There's a private named Joseph Plum Martin who kept a memoir of his service in the Continental Army. It wasn't published until decades later, but it's one of the most detailed and honest accounts we have of what it was like to be an ordinary soldier in this war. He was at Valley Forge. He writes about the hunger and the cold with a wry, dark humor that somehow makes it more affecting, not less. He doesn't romanticize it. He doesn't pretend it was glorious. He just describes what it was like, and what it was like was often miserable. And he stayed. He stayed through all of it. That's the thing about Valley Forge that I find most moving when I sit with it. Not the famous names and the famous moments, but the thousands of Josephs, ordinary men with ordinary fears, cold and hungry and a long way from home, who decided, day after day, to stay, to keep going, to see it through. While Washington's army was encamped at Valley Forge, the world was not standing still. In France, Benjamin Franklin was having an extraordinary diplomatic year. He had arrived in Paris in December 1776, and by 1778, he had become something close to a celebrity. The American sage, the philosopher-statesman who embodied the ideals of the Enlightenment in living form. The French loved him. Louis XVI's court was more cautious, but they were paying attention. The turning point was Saratoga. When news reached France in December 1777 that the Americans had defeated a British army under General Burgoyne, forced them to surrender, actually, an entire British army, it changed the calculation dramatically. France had been providing covert aid to the Americans, but Saratoga proved that these Americans could actually fight. They might actually win. And if they won with French help, France could deal a serious blow to their great rival, Britain. On February 6, 1778, while Washington's men were at Valley Forge, while von Steuben was arriving and beginning his drilling, France and the United States signed a treaty of alliance. France officially entered the war on the American side. This was enormous, transformative. It changed everything about the strategic picture. Britain was no longer just fighting a colonial rebellion. They were now fighting France and potentially Spain and the Netherlands in a global conflict. British resources that had been focused on America now had to be spread across multiple theaters. The British position in America suddenly became more vulnerable, and the American cause suddenly had the backing of one of the most powerful nations on earth. The news reached Valley Forge in May. The reaction, by all accounts, was extraordinary. Washington organized a celebration. On May 6, 1778, the army formed in review. And I want you to picture this. The same men who had arrived in December, ragged and starving, who had spent months building huts and surviving disease and learning to drill with von Steuben. Those men, now cleaner and better fed and drilling with genuine precision, formed on the parade ground in review. There were cannon salutes. Soldiers fired their muskets in rolling waves. Men cheered. Officers embraced. There was laughter, genuine laughter, echoing across the plateau that had been so grim for so long. Washington gave a speech. By his standards, it was almost effusive. The French alliance was a moment of real hope, the first clear sign that the international community had recognized the legitimacy of what they were doing. France's recognition meant American independence had credibility on the world stage. The celebration that day, the feu de joie, the rolling musket fire, the cheers, is one of the images from Valley Forge that I think doesn't get enough attention. People focus on the suffering, and the suffering was real. But there was also this moment of genuine joy, genuine hope, genuine collective release. These men had survived something terrible together, and now they had real reason to believe they might actually win. Let's take stock of what had happened between December 1777 and May 1778. The army that arrived at Valley Forge was, genuinely, close to collapse. Underfed, undersupplied, undertrained, demoralized, facing a potential crisis of confidence in its leadership. It was an army that had lost its capital and its last two major engagements. It was an army that was in danger of simply dissolving. The army that would leave Valley Forge in June 1778 was something different. Von Steuben's training had given it military competence, the ability to maneuver, to follow orders in battle, to function as a cohesive force rather than a collection of individual units. The men knew what they were doing now in a way they hadn't before. The supply situation had improved, not perfectly, never perfectly, but Greene's work as quartermaster had made the army more functional. The French alliance had given the Corps international legitimacy and strategic support that changed the entire context of the war, and something harder to quantify had happened too. The men who had survived Valley Forge had proven to themselves that they could survive Valley Forge. They had been through something awful and come out the other side. That kind of shared experience creates a bond, and it creates a particular kind of confidence that isn't arrogance. It's more like the quiet knowledge that you can handle hard things. The proof came almost immediately. On June 18, 1778, the British evacuated Philadelphia. Partly because of strategic concerns related to the French alliance and the threat to British shipping and other territories, they decided they needed to consolidate in New York. Washington's army, watching them go, moved to intercept. On June 28th at Monmouth, New Jersey, the Continental Army fought its first major engagement since Valley Forge. And what happened was instructive. The battle started badly. An American advance force under General Charles Lee encountered the British and then, controversially, infuriatingly, ordered a retreat. Washington, riding up, found his army falling back, and by multiple accounts he was as angry as anyone who served with him ever saw him. The scene of Washington confronting Lee on the battlefield is one of the more dramatic moments of the war, but here's what's important. The army did not fall apart. When Washington rallied them, they stopped retreating. When he reorganized them, they held. When the battle was rejoined, they fought. And they fought well. They stood against British and Hessian attacks. Their artillery, under Knox, was effective. Their formations, drilled by von Steuben over those months at Valley Forge, held. The battle ended essentially as a draw. Neither side gained a decisive advantage, and the British continued their march to New York. But military analysts and historians have generally seen Monmouth as a moral victory for the Americans, and more importantly, as proof of the transformation Valley Forge had achieved. This was not the same army that had struggled at Brandywine and Germantown. Something fundamental had changed. It would still be years before the war ended. The British didn't give up easily, and there were more hard years ahead. The terrible winter at Morristown, the treachery of Benedict Arnold, the brutal campaigns in the South. The road to Yorktown was long, but Valley Forge was the hinge point. It was where the Continental Army, at its lowest, found a way to become something that could win. Valley Forge entered American memory almost immediately, and the way it's been remembered says something interesting about what Americans have wanted to believe about their founding. The image that stuck was the suffering, the barefoot soldiers, the frozen ground, the endurance in the face of impossible conditions. That became the story, that Americans were tested to their absolute limit and refused to break. That idea proved enormously resonant over time, invoked in every subsequent national crisis as evidence that Americans can take a hit and keep going. There's truth in that. The endurance at Valley Forge was real, but I think the more interesting legacy is the transformation. Valley Forge wasn't just about surviving. It was about using adversity to build something better. The army that came out of Valley Forge was more capable than the army that went in. The suffering wasn't just something they got through. It was, in a strange way, part of how they became what they needed to be. Von Steuben's contributions get at something else worth thinking about. The Continental Army became more effective because someone who came from outside, a Prussian officer, an immigrant, a man who couldn't even speak English, arrived with knowledge and skills that the army needed, and then threw himself into teaching them. The story of Valley Forge is partly a story about the value of importing expertise, of being willing to learn from people who are different from you, of not letting pride get in the way of improvement. Washington's leadership over that winter is instructive in its own way. He managed upward, fighting Congress for better support. He managed downward, keeping the army's morale from collapsing. He made strategic decisions that were sound even when they were politically costly. He gave his best people the authority and space to do their best work. And he just kept going. Day after day, letter after letter, through the doubt and the pressure and the genuine fear that it might all fall apart, he kept going. That's not a small thing to model. The men at Valley Forge, the ordinary soldiers, the Josephs, remind us of something too. They were not superhuman. They were cold and hungry and scared and homesick. But they believed in something beyond themselves, and that belief held them even when the physical conditions gave them every reason to quit. The question of what we believe in enough to endure hardship for is not just a Revolutionary Era question. It's a human question, and it doesn't get old. Let's end where we started, with the men themselves. June 1778. The winter is well behind them. The hills around Valley Forge are green. The Schuylkill River is bright and fast. The air is warm. The huts they spent so much energy building will be left behind. Some will be taken over by local farmers. Some will decay and disappear. The plateau will return, over time, to something resembling what it was before 12,000 men showed up and started chopping trees. But the army marching out of Valley Forge carries something with it that it didn't have when it arrived. Call it competence, call it cohesion, call it confidence. It's harder to name than food or weapons or supplies, but it's more important than any of those. These men have been through something together. They have been cold together and hungry together and sick together. They have built a city with their own hands and drilled on a frozen parade ground until their muscles ached and learned to move as a unit, to think as a unit, to trust the men beside them. They are different now. The world they're marching into is also different. France is an ally. The British are pulling back toward New York. The future is not certain. It never is. But it is, for the first time in a while, genuinely hopeful. Washington rides at the head of the column. He has been through a difficult winter too. The political pressure, the supply battles, the daily weight of responsibility for 12,000 lives. He looks, by accounts from this period, tired but steady. He usually looks steady. The men march, and they march well. Their files are straight, their pace is good. Von Steuben's work is visible in every step. The army moves like it knows what it's doing, because now it does. And somewhere in those columns is Joseph Plum Martin, private, aged 17 or so, who will remember this winter for the rest of his life and write about it decades later with that wry honesty that makes his account so valuable. He's hungry. Probably he's still somewhat hungry. This is the Continental Army, after all. He's tired. He's been through months of hardship, but he's still here. That's the Valley Forge story. Not just survival and transformation. The worst winter producing the better army. The frozen plateau becoming the place where American independence became, for the first time, genuinely plausible. That's worth remembering. Before I wrap up, I want to mention a few things that are worth knowing if you want to dig deeper into this story. Valley Forge National Historical Park exists today, and it's genuinely worth visiting if you ever have the opportunity. The park preserves much of the original site, and there are reconstructed huts, Washington's headquarters at the Isaac Potts House, and monuments throughout. Walking the actual ground gives you a sense of scale and geography that no map or description can fully convey. You can see the hills, the river, the plateau where the camp was. It's smaller than you might expect. It's also more beautiful. The landscape that was so grim in December is genuinely lovely in spring and summer. The primary sources from Valley Forge are extraordinary. Washington's letters from this period are in the Library of Congress, and many are available online. Joseph Plum Martin's memoir, usually published under the title A Narrative of a Revolutionary Soldier, is completely accessible and endlessly readable. Dr. Albigence Waldo's diary is also available and gives the medical perspective. If you're interested in this period and haven't read primary sources, I'd really encourage you to try them. The people who were there had a voice, and they used it. Von Steuben's story after the Revolution is also interesting. He became an American citizen, was given a pension by Congress, and lived out his later years in New York. He never married. There are historians who believe he was gay, which in the 18th century was dangerous enough that it may partly explain why he left Prussia. He was, by all accounts, a beloved figure in his adopted country, and he died in 1794, 15 years after the war ended. The historiography of Valley Forge has evolved significantly. Older accounts tended to be more mythological. Washington praying in the snow, superhuman endurance, etc. More recent scholarship has focused on the actual military transformation, the supply issues, the disease, the experience of ordinary soldiers, and the contributions of often overlooked figures. The history has gotten more complicated and, I would argue, more interesting. So that's Valley Forge, a winter that came close to breaking the Continental Army. A winter that ultimately forged something better. 2,000 men who died of disease and cold and hunger. And 10,000 men who didn't, who stayed and endured and drilled and hoped and ultimately marched out in June as the core of an army that would, 3 years later, win a war and birth a nation. It's one of those stories where the outcome matters so much that we sometimes forget how genuinely uncertain it felt to the people living through it. They did not know they would win. They did not know it would work out. They just kept going anyway. If you found this video interesting, there's a lot more where it came from. We've done deep dives on Saratoga, on Benjamin Franklin in Paris, on the Southern campaigns. All the chapters of this revolution that don't always get the spotlight they deserve. If you're new here, welcome. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of history storytelling. We try to go deep, go human, and tell these stories the way they actually happened rather than the way the legend says they happened. And drop a comment below. I genuinely love to know what aspect of Valley Forge surprised you most, or what you'd like to hear more about. The comments section here is one of the better ones on the platform, and I actually read it. Thanks for spending time on this. These stories matter. The people in them were real. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one.